So for me, when I read Luke Acts and I see him describing the Pharisees in ways that I really think are characteristically Josephine, first of all, this distinctive view of Pharisee-Sadducee relations with Jesus as separating Pharisees as popular and having the support of the people and being around Jesus, and Sadducees being something different and harsh and brutal in the temple, right? And the language of Iresis and Akribea, the most precise. All this is Josephine. So when historians read surviving stories, we expect independence. And so when we read Josephus' crafted narrative, we get into it, we interpret it, we understand that these are his themes. This is his language, right? This is where he begins, his middle, and an end. And when we look at Luke Acts, therefore, and see not the same story, Luke Acts telling a completely different story. So Josephus selected his personalities and his events. He selected what he wanted to talk about to fit his narrative. And Luke Acts has a very different purpose. It's talking about Jesus and the apostles, not Josephus' thing at all. But when these points of intersection happen, you have to ask yourself, well, what's going on here?
Today, my guest is one of my favorite guests, Professor Steve Mason, Emeritus Professor, Ancient Mediterranean Cultures and Religions in the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. His degrees are from Canada's McMaster University, University at St. Michael's College, with years of graduate study in Jerusalem and Germany. A fellow of the Royal Historical Society in the UK, Professor Mason has published widely on Roman Judaea, the works of Josephus, the historical method, and Christian origins. He leads an international project providing the first commentary to 30 Greek volumes by Flavius Josephus, along with a new translation, and has contributed 3 volumes to that project. His other books include Flavius Josephus, On the Pharisees, Josephus and the New Testament, Josephus, Judea, and Christian Origins, Orientation to the History of Roman Judaea, and A History of the Jewish War from 66 to 74. Most recently, coming out this month, Jews and Christians in the Roman World. Professor Mason was born in Canada and grew up in Canada, as well as Britain and Australia. After first jobs in kitchens, factories, a mine mill, security, and counseling, Steve worked for the Memorial University of Newfoundland, Toronto's York University, Penn State, and the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. He has been a guest professor with stays in Oxford, Princeton, Constance, Berlin, Paris, Trinity College, and Rome's Pontifical Biblical Institute. I think it's safe to say we are in good hands today with a really important topic, which is Luke Acts, the author of this story. Is it possible that he might be borrowing his sources from Josephus? We're going to get into that, and I think it's very likely that this is true based on what I just heard from Professor Mason, which I have recorded right now, and I'm giving it to you. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true gnosis. And today my special guest is Dr. Steve Mason, and we're going to jump right into this discussion with the possibility of author of Luke knowing Josephus and being dependent on Josephus. And so let's jump right into it. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, Neil. It's good to see you, man. It's been a little while.
It's been a little while, but I'm excited about this conversation. You did this before with Derek on Myth Vision.
Yeah.
And yeah, I feel like we could jump into it again and revisit it, and I can maybe offer some new questions on it and maybe look at it from different angles. But it's a really fascinating topic. I don't think it'll ever get old, because the idea that the gospel writers, like, everyone wants to know, where are these gospel writers getting their information from? How do they know this? How do they know that? How do they know the geography? And so this is a interesting way to compare, because Josephus is a big historian of the time period. So it makes a lot of sense just from the thought of like, where else would they be getting data from? You know?
Yeah, yeah. No, that's that's actually a really perceptive observation right away, and because I'm not sure how much your viewers know about what scholars have done with all this stuff before, but the general idea used to be that Mark, right, the earliest of the texts, just got the information from oral tradition. And back a century ago now, there were a lot of detailed studies based on folklore studies about how oral traditions circulate. So what they discovered with Mark, or they proposed with Mark, was that if you look at the way Mark arranges material, it's in kind of thematic clumps. Like there's half a dozen conflict stories in Mark 2, and then in Mark 4, you've got some examples of parables. And he says Jesus always taught in parables. Well, I'll throw you 3 of them for an example. And then that's it. He forgets about them, even though he said Jesus always talks in parables. And then other conflict stories, and then, the trial narrative. And so the idea was that, okay, basically, one guy called Mark a trial narrative with a long introduction, right? Because like that's the meat of the thing for this author. But he wanted to throw in some background, here's some of the conflicts that got it going until 3:6, and then the conflicts with his family and the Pharisees, and then the parables, and then, some healing and cures, the demon possession, stuff in Mark 5. And then he just organized it kind of thematically until by Mark 8, you've already got him predicting his death and resurrection, right? So by halfway through the text, so that was the original idea of kind of Mark, right? And then people said, okay, but Matthew and Luke use Mark as a source, and they built it out by like 50%. So where did they get all their information from? And in the case of Luke Acts, it's even, as you said, and this is the part I wanted to commend you on, because this is a really good insight, I think, that because the guy's also writing Acts, right? He decides to write a 2-volume work. So he's got a ton more information and a lot of local color, a lot of names, the governors and, tribunes and officials of all kinds, and different kinds of travel routes and mechanisms and sailing, different kinds of ropes and knots and sails and all. Where does he get all this information from? Because he needs way more information than Mark has, right? He needs like a ton of information. So anyway, that's a long way of saying I think you're right, that the smart thing to do would be to go to the acknowledged expert in Judean affairs. Of course, he can't use Josephus for everything. There's tons of stuff like about Corinth and Ephesus and whatever in Acts that Josephus didn't write about at all. But if you're going to go, you need somebody for Judea, go to the big guy, right? He's the most famous author. Yeah, so I think you're right. I'll be quiet now.
I always picture whoever he is sitting in maybe either in Alexandria or in Pergamum. You got those 2 giant libraries. And the reason why I say that, not just because they're giant libraries, but because it seems that Christianity as a movement grows right around both these regions. So in Anatolia, right around, you get in the Pontic region, Bithynia, Phrygia, right? There's Christianity blowing up. And then also down in Egypt, you got Christianity. So I'm guessing, and I'm just some guy guessing, I'm guessing that there's probably somewhere in one of these 2 locations, the Gospels are being either written or finely tuned, maybe. I don't know what you think about that.
No idea. I mean, it's a good suggestion, but so are many others. I mean, Rome is also possible, even for Mark. Mark was often kind of located in Rome because of, we're just shooting in the dark here. I mean, scholars just grab little bits of this and that and say, okay, this suggests he was writing in Rome, or he was writing in, Asia Minor. I think, or Egypt. I think it's such flimsy evidence, not that you're putting forward, but that has survived for us to look at. It's such slight evidence that we could possibly pounce on. I mean, one thing we could do I think, is negatively say that if an author seems not to know the geography of a place like Judea, then he's probably not from Judea. He's not living there. He seems to get all the directions wrong. Then he's probably not there. I think we can do that. Or if he refers to like housing construction styles that didn't obtain in Judea, stuff like that. I think negatively we can exclude certain things, but positively trying to locate an author, I think, is extremely difficult. Antioch is another suggestion, but these are mainly because these are the places we know, right? So in the Eastern Mediterranean, it's hard to nail it down. So what I want to emphasize here is that, and you put it really, really well, Neil, at the beginning. You said you want to ask a question whether this is possibly the case, right? And this is really important, because what I wouldn't want anybody to think is that I'm here as the Josephus was a source for Luke Acts guy, right? Like I'm attached to that. It's really important to understand, because the internet is filled with people making claims, right? And they're very confident about these claims, whether it's like in the whole mythicist thing or about the historical Jesus or Paul or whatever. That's not what we as historians are allowed to do. We're just not, because once you do that, you give up the ability to do history.
Yeah.
History is not a belief system. It's not church, right? So, and that's why I also shy away from debates. Often people ask me, "Will you debate something?" Because I've made an argument for something or other. Will you debate this person, like debate a mythicist or whatever? No, I have no interest. I mean, they might be right. The point of history is to investigate the past with an open mind. Right. And you have to be open to all explanations and aware of the limitations of our evidence and of anything that you think about the evidence. So advocates, if you become an advocate, then you have to kind of give up your membership in the historical guild. And it's a fine line, because of course you are allowed, and you're in this situation where you have to defend the results of your research. Sometimes you say, this is what I think happened as a result of my investigations. I think this is most probable. Somebody's going to push back and say, I don't think that's probable. You didn't look at this or that. So, you do have to defend your positions. How you got to them, there's a fine line between that and crossing over to becoming a kind of champion of this view, right? And attaching yourself to a conclusion. And that's what we're not allowed to do. So I'm not here as an advocate of the belief or the position that Luke Acts used Josephus. Rather, this is just simply a very well-known historical problem. And the way it worked for me was, because of my work on Josephus, a publisher once asked me way at the beginning of my career, would you please write a book for us, a general readership about Josephus and the New Testament, and how they relate, because you're trained in both fields. So I said, sure, I'd be happy to do it. And part of that question, Josephus and the New Testament, is Josephus and Luke Acts, because this is an old and well-known problem. They have these things in common. So how do you explain them? And that problem has been known since the 19th century. So I reviewed all the discussions in my research. I looked at why people said what they said. And the main thing they said was that Josephus and Luke Acts agree on certain things because they use different sources, or they use the same sources. But anyway, they use sources. They didn't use each other. One did not get the material from the other. And they had their reasons for that. But the main reason was that they viewed Josephus in those days, 100 years ago, and this is where that view became kind of solidified, really about 1922, so about really a century ago. They still viewed Josephus as a kind of data bank, that he was not an intelligent author of his own. He was just assembling kind of facts and using sources from all over the place. And so if you have that mentality and you look at Luke Acts and Josephus, and you see they mention some of the same people, some of the same events, then you say, yeah, but they're in different order. Luke Acts doesn't agree with Josephus the way he arranges stuff, so they must have got it from different sources, or from the same source, but independent of each other. So what was new in my study of this stuff was simply that I've come to see, and working on Josephus for decades, already then I'd written a book on Josephus by that point. I'd come to see his work as really artful, creative narrative, right? He's a true author who crafted his stories in his own language with his own themes, his own structures. Now, this creates a different question, because if you can identify certain literary traits in Josephus, and if those things turn up in Luke Acts, where they are not part of Luke Acts literary style traits, right? Then you have a kind of telltale sign, or that's how it looks, at least, that Josephus was indeed the source for Luke Acts, because these are not free-floating facts. They are shaped. They are, well, we're going to see examples of exactly what I mean, so I won't delay on the theoretical side. Anyway, the point is, I'm not here to advocate a view. I'm not here to say that Josephus was a source for Luke Acts, but to report on my investigations, and with all due caution and hesitation. So these are the books I'm talking about. The first one, some of your viewers may know, the first edition came out in 1992, a re-edition, a new a reworking of it in 2003. But it has a chapter on, because simply my point is I had to include it, because if you're going to talk about Josephus and the New Testament, you have to deal with this question. So the point again is, I didn't have a revelation about this, right? It wasn't like I woke up one morning thinking, this is it, this is the truth, and I have to get out and tell people. No, it's not like that. The job of the historian, and I include this just because I think it's so widely overlooked. The history we learn in school depends on where you went to school, I guess, but often you get the impression that history is a bunch of facts that you have to learn. There's the truth about the past, which is written down somewhere, and you just have to learn it, right? This is not how historians see our job. If we did, it would be extremely boring, right? And nobody would ever want to be a historian if it's just a matter of kind of memorizing some facts. Those facts don't exist anywhere. The whole point of history is that the past is lost to us.
Right.
It's lost as soon as it happens. So it doesn't exist anymore. So history is the investigation of the human past. And what that means is that we identify some event we're interested in. We have word of it from a text or an inscription or coins. We're interested in something, an event, human actions of some kind. And we construct an investigation to go and pursue that thing. And the way we do it is, first of all, we look for any survivals, any evidence. It becomes evidence in the course of the investigation. It's not evidence by itself. It's just what it is, a text or a coin. But it becomes evidence once you say, okay, this is my question, and this thing, this survival is relevant. Now, the survivals include material evidence and literary texts like Josephus, right? So we have to, first of all, understand what these survivals are. Like, what is this thing? Why was it written? Or if it's a text, or why was it produced? If it's a coin, where, how, who, by whom? And then we imagine, and this is just like science, actually, in this way. You have to, like in science, you see the symptoms, right? Or in medicine, you see the symptoms. In the study of nature, biology, you see the apple tree or whatever, the infestation of disease in the apple tree. And then you have to hypothetically imagine what the causes are, because you can't see those, right? So you have to imagine what created this thing that you can see. And that's also the kind of thing we do in history, right? Is we have these texts, we have these inscriptions, coins, whatever, papyri, building remains, and then we have to imagine and test hypotheses that would explain how this stuff came about, right? So the question in this case is, we have Josephus and we have Luke Acts. We can read both of them. They exist, right? We don't have to guess about them. We can study them. We can interpret them, figure out what each one is about, what each one's themes and language and so on are. And then the question that we're after is that lost event behind them. How did they come to have so many similar bits and pieces in them? And we can test hypotheses for their explanatory power, right? Their ability to explain the evidence with little remainder or with nothing, preferably with no remainder at all. So the issue is that there have been several striking overlaps that exist only between Josephus and Luke Acts. These are not found in Mark, Matthew, or John, right? But Luke Acts has a ton of these things, a relative ton of them. Famous ones, the rebels, Judas, Theudas, the Egyptian prophet, the Sicarii, the Pharisees as a school, and so on. These are only in Luke Acts and in Josephus. So where you have two texts that show striking similarities, you have three basic explanations, right, of how those came about. The first one is that let's call them A and B. A used B, or B used A, or they're independent of each other, in which case they depend on a common source. Now, anybody who's a teacher or a professor will know this experience when you find two student essays that have sections that agree with each other of word for word, right? Then you can say, okay, either student A borrowed from B or the other way around, or they work together. That's also a possibility if you have reason to think they know each other. But in this case, it's either one used the other, or if you're sure that, if you're teaching a distance course and one of these students is in Australia and one's in, Canada, then probably they didn't collaborate or borrow each other's work, and in which case you think they probably borrowed a common source, like a Wikipedia page or something like that. And that turns out to be the case. So the prevailing view among scholars in sorting out this problem has always been the third option, right? And the reason for that, as I hinted before, is that even though there are very similar things and names and events that keep turning up in these two texts, they're in a different order and they're, differently configured. So the question is, if A was borrowing B, why wouldn't he just borrow it, and put it in the correct order if he wanted to get reliable information? But this argument overlooks the difference between events and their distinctive literary representations in different authors. What do I mean by that? What I mean is it treats them as if the event and its interpretation were the same thing, right? So that if a census happens, well, it happens, and the report of it is just a report, a neutral kind of report. But that's not the case. We know that in real life that doesn't happen. Events don't come with their own meaning or their own explanation. It's only authors who write about them, even on the news, right? If you look at, in the US, Fox News or CNBC or CNN, they're going to talk about the same events, but they're going to talk about them very differently. Not because they're trying to spin necessarily, just because you can't do anything other than that. When you put things into words, you have a beginning, a middle, and an end. You have to choose the language you use and the way you frame it. So writing about events is a very different thing from the events happening themselves. So this assumption that scholars have had is that all authors would choose the same events and write them up in the same language. Right. So when you see the same language in Luke, Acts, and Josephus, the scholars said, well, they're just borrowing from, common knowledge, either from what everybody knew about the events or from a common source. But that can't happen in the wild, in real life. You do not find two things that agree like that. Let me give you some illustrations. But anyway, my question is then, why does Luke Acts reflect actually the distinctive choices, outlook, and language of Josephus? That's the question. So this option that scholars have had, I think, should be questioned for this reason.
Can I ask you something?
Yeah.
What was their? Did they ever guess on what the source was? They just
said
we lost the text, maybe.
I'm glad you raised the question, because that, in my conclusion, I will say exactly that if there was a common source, it looks exactly like Josephus. So that's the problem, right? Because they never did. They never did. Unlike, say, Q studies, right, where scholars hypothesize this saying source for Matthew and Luke, right?
Yeah.
But
Well,
then they spend a huge amount of time trying to reconstruct it, right? To say
yeah.
what is that source that would explain. And they debate and they say, well, we think this was in it. No, I think that was in it. Okay, but nobody ever did that. Nobody ever even tried to do it for this alleged common source.
So no one ever came through and said, "Hey, Nicholas of Damascus, maybe," or something.
No. Nicholas is too early for much of this stuff. He was at the time of King Herod, but nobody. That's it. I mean, it's basically a cop out, right? It's to say that well, we don't think that one borrowed from the other, and it's like in the U.S. a Hail Mary pass, right? Just throw it down the field. Say, yeah, that's there must have been some source that they used. What source? What did it look like?
You mentioned mythicists before, and not to beat up on them too much, but I think, and they do the same thing where they'll say Jesus came from a tradition where there was a celestial Son of God, and then I'll say, or you say, well, what tradition is that? Oh, well, it's gone now. Well, that's kind of sort of similar. It's like, well, you got to show, you at least show some evidence of some sort of tradition. If you don't have that, then what are we doing here? We're just shooting for the moon now. I can just make up whatever I want.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I mean, it happens too often even in scholarship generally, as we see with this example. There are areas of scholarship where people get really excited about something and drill down and try to reconstruct the thing. That's what we should be doing. But there are other cases, and I think this is just part of the general neglect of Josephus. I think it's because people had such a dim view of him for such a long time that it just wasn't interesting, right? He's just a collector of facts. And so, yeah, okay, well, he got these facts and Luke Acts got these facts. We're interested in Luke Acts, not so much in Josephus. But now the pendulum has swung and people are much more interested in Josephus.
Do you think it also could be because tradition wants to put Luke in the 1st century and Josephus is late 1st century, and they want to put him before that, maybe?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that's changed also completely now.
Right.
Of course, you have lots of Luke Acts scholars who are just Luke Acts scholars. They're not Josephus
They're
scholars.
saying 140 maybe.
Yeah. On other internal grounds, right? That it's got to do with Marcion or, something like that. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know about all that either, but it's true that if he used Josephus' Antiquities, and Antiquities was finished in 93, 94 CE, then that puts Luke at least around 100, maybe a little bit later.
Right.
By this criterion alone, had to be at least around 100 or later. So yeah, I definitely think, because you still see some pushback today from very conservative scholars on this idea, who use that as a measure. You say, well, we don't like the idea of the Luke Acts in the 2nd century. We think there's other evidence that keeps it. I mean, some even very conservative scholars would like to date it. Luke, 70s. Acts to the 60s.
Yeah,
because it ends there, right? Because the story ends there.
Oh, I see.
So they would say, well, why wouldn't it have gone on if the author were writing at a later point? But I think there's no reason to put it so early. And there are indications in the text itself, like even the prologue to Luke, the author positions himself as one who has gathered evidence from those who were eyewitnesses, he claims. So, he's already a generation or two later, at least by his own characterization of his work, right? He doesn't claim to be an early writer, an eyewitness.
Yeah.
Anyhow, yeah. So by all means, ask any questions you want. If I get carried away, just jump in.
Oh yeah, I think that was. I mean, I will say this though, you just made, and for those conservative scholars, you have to admit, wow. I mean, even as Luke trying to, whoever wrote this, trying to position himself in this time period. The story does seem to just drop off after the shipwreck. I mean, looking at
Yeah.
X, just ends. It is kind of a weird thing, but I almost wonder if it was designed that way to make it seem like this is when the story stops. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I think that there are all kinds of literary reasons why people do this. I mean, if you look at the Gospels, right, look at the end of Mark. So a lot of people get all uptight about the end of Mark. I mean, the so-called short ending, 16:8, because it just ends with, the angels telling the women who go to the tomb to prepare Jesus' body, go to Galilee and tell the disciples that Jesus will meet them there. And the text just ends by saying they said nothing to anybody because they were terrified.
Right.
And that's it. And
yeah, so you can see why. Yeah, that makes sense.
I mean, that's a real abrupt ending.
Yeah.
And you can see why other people supplied longer endings, and Matthew and Luke, using Mark, both made far more, happy endings to the whole business, because it just ends very abruptly. But if you understand the Gospel of Mark, well, at least I think it's quite plausible to understand Mark in a way that makes that ending perfectly sensible. But my point is, in terms of dating, you could say, because that ends very abruptly with Jesus' resurrection, this text should be dated to 32 or 33 or something like that. But nobody dates it that early, because it needs a generation, and there are all kinds of indications in the text that a generation has gone by. So I don't think for Luke Acts, therefore, the fact that it ends with Paul's imprisonment, that means anything. Stories can end whenever the author wants them to end,
right?
For his own literary reasons. Yeah. But anyway, his purpose is it's the reason it's called the Acts of the Apostles is, to chart that first generation. And that's where he ends it, at the end of the first generation, right? With Paul in prison in the 60s under Nero. That's a generation gone by. So that's where he ends the story. I don't think we need any exotic reasons beyond that. So there are three assumptions I'm making that I should spell out, because if the audience doesn't understand that I'm making these assumptions, then the points I make later with the specifics might not seem very clear. So let me spell them out. First of all, on this question of the differences, and therefore one didn't use the other, I think we have to explode that right from the ground, because we know for sure, we can demonstrate it 1,000 times over, that in ancient rhetorical training, and rhetorical training was ancient education, basically, it all funneled towards being an orator, being a persuasive speaker. In that training, and we have handbooks, training, they have survived. The handbooks that show how to train somebody to be a good orator. They train students to use even famous sources like Homer and tragedy, but to change them and use them in new creative ways. Because if you just repeat something, that's considered extremely lame, right? You're useless. You're just anybody can copy stuff. The point is to take something and give it a new context and a new meaning, and show how you can do that, right? Especially if it's a famous text, like to reuse a saying from Homer or from tragedies.
So you mean you're talking like the Aeneid uses Homer, or like something different than that?
Yeah, not only that, but in the training of students, like so we have these books called the Pro Gymnasmata, which means before you go to the gymnasium for your higher level education, this is like the entry kind of training to become basically proficient in rhetoric. They go through all these exercises, and they have names for them, like metaphrasis. Metaphrasis is like a paraphrase. Well, they also have paraphrasis, which is paraphrase. Metaphrasis is redoing things. So, for example, okay, you have this situation in Sophocles' Antigone, right, with Creon the king and forbidding burial for her brother. Okay, change the situation around. What if he'd been insisting on burial, and she was the one who didn't want to bury him? Something like that. So my point is that the point of rhetorical training is to, like lawyer training, I guess, in a way, is to teach you to be flexible in your thinking, right? To be able to change the argument around. If you're now defending this person, you need to make this kind of argument. If you're prosecuting them, you need to make this kind of argument from the same evidence, right? So, but the way they did it was with texts, right? So show us how you can make a positive argument, a negative argument, a prosecution, a defense from the same evidence. And this also means that you rearrange stuff to make it work. And we can see it at work in authors like Plutarch, right, where he has sayings that he puts in the mouths of different people. So in his essays on the Moralia, he uses some of these sayings in one way, and then in his biographies, he uses them in another way. And in Josephus, we see the same thing. He uses, his material, even his own material, he reworks it in his later works and rearranges it. So my simple point is, Neil, that the fact that two sources differ, or you can see it in the Gospels, right? Matthew uses Mark, but he changes it. He just changes it. He just flat out says, no, it didn't happen like that. No, he elevates the status of the disciples for one thing, whereas Mark is always, trashing them. Matthew doesn't like that approach, so he takes over the story and he just changes the ending. And instead of saying they didn't believe and their hearts were hardened after Jesus, walks on the water, they worshipped him. And instead of Peter just being told off, Jesus says, yes, you're Peter, and I'll build my church on this rock in Matthew. So Matthew takes the stories from Mark, but just completely reworks them. The resurrection story completely, gives it a whole fuller, new, brighter picture. And Luke does the same thing. So we can actually see this at work, this principle at work, where we can see that an author is using a source. That doesn't mean that he keeps the same order, keeps the same meaning. He uses it however he wants to use it. That's the point.
Interesting. Now, this might be a different topic, but Plutarch, when he does his lives, he seems to be able to take two different people from two different time periods.
Mm-hmm.
But my favorite one is the Demetrius and Mark Antony one.
Mm-hmm.
I love that one. I don't know why. I just like that one for some reason. And he seems to be able to parallel these lives. It's not the same as like copying or borrowing exactly. But do you think it might be the same kind of training where you're looking at old texts and retelling them through a different character, maybe?
Absolutely. Plutarch is really showing off in a good way. I mean, he's showing what he can do. Yeah. Look at this. You never thought of this. I'm going to show you how these two guys have a lot in common and what their differences are. And then in the comparison, I'll, give you points to each one.
Cicero and Demosthenes, that's a good one too.
Yeah, Cicero and Demosthenes, yeah. Now, once he's done it, we can all think, oh yeah, of course. Why wouldn't you? Demosthenes, the great orator, Cicero, Rome's great orator, of course. Right. But as far as we know, nobody done it before. It was a very clever idea, and it's a very creative. I mean, yes, it's in exactly the same spirit of rhetoric, which is all about, moral values and things like that, and arguing them and showing them and using evidence in creative ways. Yeah. So that's the first assumption, and we need to get this in our head so that we don't have this mechanical view, right? That if somebody used a source, why wouldn't he just copy it? Well, he could do if he was, really useless, but that's not what ancient writers did, generally speaking. That's the first thing. Second thing is what we've already covered, just to reiterate it, is Josephus quickly became the authoritative source for Judean reality. That is to say, other writers wrote about it. We know this. Well, we know some of their names. And he mentions in the beginning of his war a whole bunch of writers who have been writing about the recent war. None of them has survived. The most famous one was Justus of Tiberias. His work lasted for some hundreds of years, but even it hasn't survived at all. Josephus is the only one that survived. And it looks like, according to a number of scholars, including me, that Tacitus used Josephus already, just a couple decades later. And we know for sure that Aelius Herodian used him, a grammarian writing in the middle 2nd century. He quotes him all over the place. Whenever he wants, he has a name, a term, a proper name for something that is related to Judea, he cites Josephus for it. So it's clear that he became very quickly the authority. And later, Christian authors use him like crazy. So it stands to reason, as we said right at the beginning, that Luke-Acts would use him. And then the final assumption I want to make, and this comes back to something I already said, now I want to elaborate a little bit, is that events and the description of events, the literary account of events, are two qualitatively different things, right? So what I mean by that, I'm going to use some imagery here that at least I like very much. I see the past something like this, right? It's just chaos.
Yeah.
That is to say, events do not come with shapes. They don't, explain themselves. They don't have a beginning, a middle, and an ending. They don't have a structure. Events are all embedded with each other, tangled up with each other, flowing with each other, and from different perspectives, people experience them differently. Of course, even a visit to the dentist or a flight on a plane, all of these mean different things. They start and stop for different people at different times, depending on, your experience. So that means that if this is true, then what does it mean to construct a narrative of the past or a story about the past? Well, you have to choose a few selected things that you want to talk about, because you can't talk about everything. You have to choose things of interest to you for whatever reason, whatever's motivating you, and you join up the dots into a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end, with some kind of tone to it, some kind of color, some kind of perspective, some kind of themes, some kind of consistent language to make a story out of it. Maybe for the musicians in the audience, music analogy. You only have, so I played saxophone, and you only have 33 notes, right? In a saxophone range. Well, leaving aside falsetto, you have only 33 notes, 2.5 octaves. But according to the streaming services, there are something like 70 million songs made from these notes.
Wow.
Now, how is that? How on earth is that possible, right? Well, it's possible because, of course, sorry about that. I was going to give you an example of something. I was going to play a little game, and I hit the advance key. How is it possible? Because of the combinations, right? And using a little bit of a rest, using a little bit of an extended note. So just with 3 or 4 notes, you can already create something that's extremely distinctive. My point is, those two, the clips I played, were basically like 3 notes. And yet, from the 3 notes, from the timing, from the color, right, of the bit, you know what tune it is. Like most people who know the songs, they would know immediately
Right off the bat,
what these are, right? Now, when you think that there are nearly 120,000 ancient Greek words, not just 33 notes, right? What this means is that when any artistic creation has a huge amount of canvas to play with, right? So to construct sentences and themes and color, right? You just have a playground to work with. So that means if you find the same stuff in 2 authors, then it demands an explanation, right? It's not just like, oh, how about that? Now, it's different with cliches, right? Like as a matter of fact, or, once upon a time, or, could be this, could be that. Things like everyday phrases, well, we all use them, so they don't count, right? But if, I don't know if you know this song, but if you see somebody using these words as the miller told his tale, or a whiter shade of pale, well, you know immediately nobody puts those words together except in this very famous song by Procol Harum, right? The whiter shade of pale, because those words just they're not cliches. They don't normally go together. Some artists put them together, right? So that's how we can detect plagiarism, and that's I think there have been some recent lawsuits in the U.S. Among musicians being charged with, and in Britain, musicians charged with borrowing like 5 notes from some other musician who came up with this. But it's enough because you can say this wouldn't happen by coincidence, right? If you have this, and here's another way to test it. If you look at truly independent text, here you can do the check very quickly by looking at just do a Google search for Plato, and here are a few hits. And what you find is these are all independent accounts. They're similar, they cover similar ground, but they're completely different. So one says, the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Plato is one of the world's best known, most widely read, studied philosophers, student of Socrates, teacher of Aristotle. Okay. And you might think, okay, anybody's going to say that, but they don't. Because the next one says he's one of the most important Greek philosophers. He founded the Academy in Athens. His works on philosophy, politics, and mathematics very influential. Right? He's not saying anything different substantively, but the language is completely different, right? Because it's independent. Similar, the next one from WikiQuote. Now you've got this person. Why wouldn't we give the dates and the Greek name? So he does that. Was an immensely influential classical philosopher, student of Socrates. It's different. It's not contradictory, but it's different. It's unique, right? And it's the same with the fourth, the fifth one. He's a classical Greek philosopher, mathematician, student of Socrates, writer of philosophical dialogues, founder of the Academy, and ancient Greek philosophers. And so they're different. Now, if you contrast that, because Plato is so famous that everybody, all these different people wrote about him in their own language. But now that guy I mentioned to you who quotes Josephus, Aelius Herodian, hardly anybody knows about him, right? So when you look at a Google search for him, you'll find, some diversity. So the first, second, and third ones are different. Aelius Herodianus, Greek name, or Herodian, was one of the most celebrated grammarians. And then the second one, Herodian. And so this is different, right? That's independent. Third one, independent as well, but that's announcing a new book, right, from the Garter. But look at the.
Oh, you copied Wikipedia.
Yeah, look at the fourth and fifth ones, right?
I don't know who this guy is. Let's just copy the other guy.
They're identical, right?
Yeah.
Now, in these cases, it's understandable because they're both Wikipedia offshoots, right? DPpedia and the other one, Wiki2H. So it's understandable. But my simple point is, if you didn't know, you could just see right away that independent writers do not agree in their language like that. That one is borrowing from another, right? You know it. It's for sure. So when historians read surviving stories, we expect independence. And so when we read Josephus' crafted narrative, we get into it, we interpret it, we understand that these are his themes. This is his language, right? This is where he begins, his middle, and an end. And when we look at Luke Acts, therefore, and see not the same story, Luke Acts telling a completely different story. So Josephus selected his personalities and his events out of an interminable mass of stuff. He selected what he wanted to talk about to fit his narrative. And Luke Acts has a very different purpose. It's talking about Jesus and the apostles, not Josephus' thing at all. But when these points of intersection happen, you have to ask yourself, well, what's going on here? And in the time that remains, I would like to work quickly, if I can, if I don't take too much time, through 5 examples. And what unites these examples is they are at home in Josephus, I hope to show. And they also appear in Luke Acts where they are not at home. They don't have any ongoing thematic connections, and they seem to reflect Josephus's particular framing and his connections. And this puts the question on a whole different foundation, right? From the old idea, these are just free-floating data, which could have come from anywhere. I don't think so. If they bear the hallmark of Josephus's hand, right? Now, there are many other interesting parallels that I'm not going to talk about, so let me just review what some of those are. Both of these authors show that they know classical literature, but they don't consider themselves classical writers, right? But they know it. They both know tragedy. They both use phrases from Greek literature that a knowing audience would recognize and say, yeah, these guys are clued in. But they don't consider it important. Both of them are on the margins of Jewish and Christian, both on the margins of Greco-Roman culture. Both are steeped in the Bible. Both center their stories in Jerusalem. Both write in a kind of historical way. Josephus explicitly, Lukács never explicitly, but borrowing historical kind of tropes. Both claim to focus on divine revelation, Josephus through Moses, Lukács through Jesus and prophecy. Both are suspicious of Greek rhetoric and speechifying. The background from Josephus illuminates episodes in Acts in certain ways. So here, I'm not saying this proves Acts dependence on Josephus. These are other examples I'm talking about here, but let's look at an example or two. In Acts 12:20, the story is that King Agrippa puts on a robe and then is worshipped, and he accepts the worship, and then he's struck dead by an angel. Now, Josephus explains that he wore a cloak woven in silver thread, which caught the sun's rays, and I'll show you on that on the next slide. And that's why he was worshipped as a god, because he looked like he just became suddenly lit up. And Acts doesn't tell you that, but it does say he puts on a robe and is worshipped. So the story makes much more sense if
When
you
did he
know
actually die in reality?
in 44 CE.
So how long after this event?
So Josephus is writing 50 years later. Right?
Oh, so he doesn't tell you what year. You don't know when this is going down when he puts the robe on.
Yeah, 44 CE. 44, the year 44.
Oh, so it's the same year he ends up dying.
He dies right away. As a result, that's why he dies, according to both Josephus and Lukács.
Oh, so it does. Okay, I wonder if it's historical or not. Interesting.
So they both say that he's struck dead. Now, Josephus says he got a case of worms after that and died a few days later. Acts says he was struck down. And Josephus' account is not, I mean, we know he died in 44 CE, and he died young. He died at 53 or so. Well, wow. I think it's young. Sense. But Josephus attributes it to his accepting worship as a god, and when he should have said, no, don't worship me, worship God. But the reason is that he had this very shiny clothing on, and he was facing sun in the theater at Caesarea, facing the coast, and the sun was out there, out on the sea, and it illuminated his clothing. People looked at him and said, wow, you're a god. And he should have said, no, I am not. But he failed to do that, and so he died. Another case is Acts 24, where the governor Felix meets Paul with his wife, the governor's wife, Drusilla. Now, Acts doesn't explain this to you. It just says, it was Felix's wife, Drusilla. And she's Judean. She's a Jew from Judea, and he married her. But Acts goes on to say that Paul lectured Felix on self-control and coming judgment, and Felix was terrified at Paul's little lecture. But Acts doesn't explain why, because it doesn't say anything about who Drusilla was. But Josephus explains that Felix had taken Drusilla from her husband. Like he simply got, lustful. He saw her and he liked her and he wanted her. So her husband, another local king, Azizus, had been circumcised in order to become a Jew, in order to be qualified to marry this Herodian princess. Felix just arrives in town and looks at her and says, hey, baby, let's get it on. And doesn't get circumcised or anything. And she leaves her husband, who did get circumcised, for Felix. And now Acts just says, well, here comes Felix with Drusilla. And Paul begins to lecture him on self-control and the coming judgment. And Felix becomes terrified at this prospect. Acts doesn't explain why, but the story makes a lot more sense if you happen to know Josephus's version. And similarly, in Acts, the next chapter, in Acts 25:3, Agrippa and Berenike walk in. So King Agrippa II and Queen Berenike walk in together and hear Paul's case. In Acts, you assume that they're married. You assume this is a husband and wife, the king and the queen. And they come in great pomp. And Paul says to the king, I realize you are an expert in Jewish law. So, I kind of bow to you. This is all kind of ironic if you read Josephus, because you learn there that, of course, Berenike is actually Agrippa's sister, with whom he was rumored to be having a long-term affair. And she had married a guy named Polemo, another regional king, who got circumcised in order to marry her. She's Drusilla's sister. And then left him. She dumped him. And she'd only married him, according to the story, in order to scotch the rumor that she was sleeping with her brother. So here, Acts doesn't explain any of this, just has them show up together. And then Paul, it would seem ironically, saying, I realize you're an expert in Jewish law. Well, he's not really living according to Jewish law if the rumors are true. But that's only in Josephus, it's not in Acts. So these are all very interesting parallels, right?
Right.
Which look very suggestive of the author's knowledge of Josephus, but I am not suggesting that they are strong evidence of influence. So I want to make that clear.
Okay.
These could be explained in other ways. The author just knew this stuff from other sources, from general knowledge, scuttlebutt, rumor, whatever. So I don't think they're strong evidence, but they're interesting. Right, I think they are interesting. So on the Agrippa's robe, just to clarify that one, here are the two passages. Acts says, the Tyrians and Sidonians came to him in a body, asked for reconciliation. They were angry with each other. On an appointed day, he put on his robes, took his seat on the platform, delivered a public address, and they shouted, the voice of a god and not a mortal. And immediately God struck him down. That's in Acts. Now, the story in Josephus, he'd completed his third year. He came to Caesarea and he put on spectacles. That doesn't mean eyeglasses. That means he put on, games and stuff like big, performances in honor of Caesar. And on the second day of the spectacles, he put on a robe made entirely of silver. So silver threads with an amazing texture. And he entered the theater at the beginning of the day. Well, at that time, with the sun's first rays, the silver made an incredible flashing and shining appearance, which sent a sort of shiver of fear through those who were looking at it. And right away, his flatterers began to raise their voices, calling him a god. They implored him, please be lenient. We confess you're greater than human nature. And the king neither scolded them nor absolved them of this impious flattery. And suddenly a severe pain seized his stomach after beginning violently, and he departed this life. So my point again is that, you can see, right, this story in Acts, just that little note about him putting on his royal robes is not, it's not elaborated. You don't have any reason why they called him a god in Acts. In Josephus, he makes it very, very clear what's going on, right? So here's the theater in Caesarea. Here's old Agrippa there, and he suddenly shines like a torch, and they say, "Wow, guy must be a god." So anyway, all of those things I'm saying are not the kind of proof you need, and I don't think there is any such thing as proof here. We're not talking about mathematical proof. But there are the 5 examples I want to run through now are cases where you have distinctive Josephine interests showing up, it seems to me, in Luke Acts. If that's true, then it will be very difficult to explain those, I think, without the hypothesis that Luke Acts is borrowing from Josephus. How exactly he's borrowing, we don't know. But here's the evidence. Okay. So the first example then is this whole nexus of incidents. The census under Quirinius in 6 CE, right? A property registration, a revolt or rebellion against it, led by Judas of Galilee, and the fallout from that. Now, first thing to notice is that, of course, Matthew knows nothing about all this. But Luke chooses it, the census under Quirinius, as a pivotal event in his story. First in Luke 2, right, in the account of Jesus' birth, because that's what gets Jesus' parents to Bethlehem in Luke. Unlike Matthew, everybody probably knows this, but in Matthew, the story is Jesus' family is actually from Bethlehem. They don't have to go there. They're already from there in Matthew. They have to leave there because of the Herod's massacre of the innocents. And Herod dies in 4 BCE, right? So sometime before that, in 5 or 6 BCE, Jesus would be born, and he's massacring all the children. And because of that, in Matthew, Jesus' family has to leave and go to Egypt. And then they were going to come back when Herod dies, but they learn that his son Archelaus is in power. And they think, well, he's just as bad as his father, so they're not going to return home. And instead, they go and settle in Galilee in a town called Nazareth, according to Matthew 2:21 or so. That's Matthew's story. He knows nothing about a census. Luke, however, says, in those days, a decree went out from Emperor Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first apographe in Greek, a property registration, and it happened while Quirinius was governor of Syria. All went to their towns to be registered, and so that's why Joseph and Mary end up going from Nazareth, where they live, unlike Matthew, where they go and settle in Nazareth. Here, they live in Nazareth, in Galilee, but they have to travel to Bethlehem because they are descended from David 1,000 years earlier, and that's where they should go, to David's town, Bethlehem. Well, it's a tricky one, historically. But anyway, Luke Acts makes it pivotal, right? That's a crucial element in the story in Luke Acts. And then later in Acts, in the meeting in the council, the Pharisee Gamaliel, he's trying to defend the Christians from the high priests who want them killed. And he says, look, consider carefully what you want to do, because some time ago, Theudas rose up claiming to be somebody. He was killed. After him, Judas the Galilean rose up at the time of the census, the apographe, and got people to follow him. So in Luke Acts, you have this pivotal event of the census under Quirinius and a revolt under Judas, right? This is the big nexus that informs the story all the way through. So why does Luke have this when Matthew knows nothing about it? Well, 6 CE was a pivotal date in the real political life of Judea and Syria, because that's the year in which Herod's son Archelaus was banished, and Judea was annexed to Syria, and therefore the governor of Syria, Sulpicius Quirinius, takes a census for taxation purposes throughout his whole province, including Judea now. But you can relate all this stuff without any of those details. You were going to say something?
Yeah, if they were annexed in 6, who possessed them before that?
So before that, they were an independent, well, notionally independent territory under Archelaus. So
I was going to say, I thought Pompey was the guy who took all this land, but this is all side stuff anyway, so it doesn't.
Yeah, no, he did. So just to clarify, Pompey took it in 63 BCE, and it was made part of Syria. But then when the Romans, they much prefer to have a client king or an allied king take care of it also. They don't have to worry about it.
Yeah.
Somebody they can trust. So they chose King Herod, right? And so
it.
he took care of it all for them. He says, don't worry about it. I'll take care of it for you. A loyal ally from 40 BC through 4 BC when he dies. And then his son Archelaus takes over. Augustus, the emperor, says, okay, I'll let Archelaus see if he can pull it off.
Keep the deal going.
But he didn't. Archelaus screwed up, and so Augustus had to kick him out and banish him to the west. And therefore he brought it back under province of Syria. So, so it was a pivotal moment. But my point is now that you can tell this story in many different ways, and you don't need to include all the elements: the census, Quirinius, Judas the Galilean, or his partner Tzadok, the Pharisee, as we learn later. Different writers, independent writers, would mix and match and do it differently. Well, we already saw Matthew doesn't even mention it at all, and he's an independent writer, right? But the curious thing is that Josephus himself, the first time he tells this story, he says that Judea became this is in war, so his first work, the Judean War, he says Judea became a province under Coponius. So he refers only to the local governor, not Quirinius, not Sulpicius Quirinius. And he says nothing about a census. He just says that an eccentric guy named Judas the Galilean, who was a sophist, who began his own philosophical school, rejected direct Roman rule. But he says nothing about either Quirinius or the census, right? So my point here is that when you're writing a story, you choose what you want to talk about. And even Josephus, the first time he tells this story, he doesn't mention Quirinius or the census. So it's not, my point again is that events don't demand that they be related a certain way. It's up to authors how they relate events, right?
This would be like comparing the way Fox and CNN relate the same thing in different ways.
Yeah, exactly.
You're getting the same event, but it's being told a little tweaked differently.
Yeah, and including different parts of it, using different language. Yeah.
Now he's talking about the school that Josephus is talking about is the what do they call that Judas starts?
Well, I know what you want me to say. The fourth philosophy. I think you want me to say that.
Yeah. Isn't that what he said? Or no?
But in war, no, not yet. In antiquities, he will call it the fourth philosophy. Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
The reason I say that is, well, it's a bit complicated. I'm laughing because so many scholars take the fourth philosophy as if it were a real thing, as if guys in Judea, if you bumped into them on the street, said, do you belong to any? He says, yeah, I belong to the fourth philosophy. Here's my card. I'm a member of the fourth philosophy. That doesn't make any sense, because the fourth philosophy is a literary creation of Josephus, because he describes three philosophies, right? But we're going to see in a second that that's already his creation. It's not what anybody on the ground would have seen, that there were three philosophies or four philosophies.
But that's also more evidence that they're using Josephus.
Yes,
because Luke's the one that actually mentions this branch.
Yes, exactly.
I'm ahead of you. No, I'm just kidding. No, I see where you're going, though. I see where you're going.
No, it's good. It's good. You're ahead of me. Exactly so. So this is not false, what he says in War 2, but it's also not all the things you could say. No joining Syria, no property registration, no mention of Quirinius and the census. That all comes only later in Antiquities, and it agrees with Josephus's emphasis. So Josephus will only mention it in Antiquities, and it comes in Luke Acts. Now, curiously, later in War, Josephus will indicate that he knows about Quirinius in the census, because he mentions it later in War 7. So in the same work, he will mention Quirinius in the census, but he didn't mention it when he was describing the events of 6 CE. So what that proves to us, beyond any doubt, is that an author can know a lot of stuff and just choose, when he's making his description, he chooses what he wants to mention. So events and their description are two completely different things. That's my simple point. So when Josephus referred to it in War 2, in the events of 6 CE, he didn't mention joining Syria, property registration, Quirinius, or census. right? So those things do not have to be mentioned. But in his later antiquities, he will mention all of them, the very same things that turn up in Luke Acts, right? And he also adds that Judas partnered with Zadok there, which he didn't mention in war. But what this means is, and this we have to kind of think about this for a moment, it also means there could have been 10 guys involved, right? Just because he now only mentions two of them, he didn't mention Zadok at all in war. Now he mentions him in antiquities. If he'd written a third work, he could have said, oh, and there was Eleazar and, Chaim and two other guys as well. We don't know because an author chooses what he wants to tell in each story. Sure. So it becomes very interesting that Luke Acts has the same nexus of events as Antiquities 17 to 18, when we know for sure that these were not just facts that everybody, would have had to talk about. By the way, before I continue, just very quickly, some of your viewers will be interested, I'm sure, if they don't already know about it, this inscription that was found in Beirut in the 17th century is undated, but here's a soldier who he achieved some prominence in the Roman army, and he's going through his career, like I mentioned that other inscription from Flavius Silva. So here's an inscription going through all of his career. And at one point in the highlighted bit in the middle, you can see he says, at the order of Quirinius, I made a census of the male citizens of the city of Apamea. There were 117,000 of them. So here's, external evidence of a census, property registration taken under Quirinius as governor of Syria. So it confirms that there was
Apamea. I recognize that word, that town Apamea is where Pliny the Elder says there's the Tetrarchy of the Nazarenes. Now I know the scholars say that that's not the Nazareth, but it is interesting how you have the city of Apamea there.
Yeah. So it's up in northern Syria. Yeah. Well, Pliny's that will be a whole other discussion. But,
I know.
Yeah. So anyway, but external evidence for that census. So just to clarify, come back to you were asking what happened before, Neil. So from 40 BC to 6 CE, it was like this. The province of Syria looks like this big kind of ear on the eastern, the whole eastern seaboard of the Mediterranean. So in that period until 6, you had the imperial legate, that's the governor, Quirinius, or his predecessors, were all up in the north of the province, based in Antioch, now Antakya today in Turkey. And they had 4 legions up in the northern half, all based some relatively near the Euphrates River, because that was the border with the Parthian Empire, right? So that's where you have to deter aggression. In the south, they left all this to King Herod and his sons, right? Augustus left all this to them to administer. But when Archelaus is kicked out from 6 CE, you have the same situation, except now they need to send a junior governor, an equestrian. For example, Pontius Pilate will have this role later, but at the beginning, it's this chap named Coponius who is sent, and he has charge only of some auxiliary soldiers based in the south, right? So it's now unified as the province of Syria.
I can't help but to wonder, how did the Romans make it seem so easy to control places compared to when you look at the Byzantines, and they just can't keep anything, they can't hold anything together anymore. It's kind of funny how you see that,
Well, the Romans, I mean,
they're logistical masters at trading and keeping things, logistical masters.
Well, they were in a sense, but I mean, most historical research has shown that they actually stumbled into most of this stuff, that they didn't actually have great plans. They were not super planners, but they had instincts, and their instincts were about power and how you preserved it, right? And their big innovation, according to most recent scholarship of the last 50 years or so, 60 years, has emphasized their creative thinking, that instead of just kind of oppressing people, which is the old image of, imperialism or the Roman Empire, they actually put a great premium on relationships,
Yeah.
social relationships, but giving a buy-in to the local elites so that everybody's on the same page, right?
Yeah.
And I think you have dealt with this before, so it's not news to you.
Right.
But I think that's it. And they were just very good at it. Now, the problem, of course, is by the Byzantine period, so many other factors have changed. So it's not, I wouldn't say it's necessarily that the Romans did this well and the Byzantines couldn't do it anymore. It's just that after hundreds of years of change, all kinds of conditions have changed as well, right? So it's just not working the same way. Yeah. Anyhow, so in terms of the actual events of 6 CE, the question is, did Luke simply relate what he knew had happened independently, or did he know some other official sources? Well, this is unlikely, because Matthew knows nothing about it and has a completely different account. Second, Luke implies in Luke 1:5 that John the Baptist's birth and therefore Jesus' birth are very close to the time of King Herod. He says at this time, and he's just talking about King Herod, is when it all happened. But Herod died in 4 BCE, and the census is in 10 years later, right? 6 CE. So it's unlikely he knew what had happened independently. And also he says there was a worldwide census organized by Augustus. Well, Augustus would only take a census of Roman citizens. That's what he did several times. He talks about it in his Res Gestae, how he took a census of Roman citizens. But that's different from this.
Yeah.
And the notion of having everybody travel to their ancestral homes is crazy.
Right. Who's doing all this writing, and who's going to? It's crazy to think about that.
Yeah. I mean, really, especially 1,000 years before. How do we even? And we don't know today, even with all our DNA services and all that.
Yeah.
We don't know who our ancestors were 1,000 years ago.
No way.
Or where they live. So the whole thing is quite weird. But it makes sense.
Genealogy going back to King David.
Yeah, exactly. And that's not where you have any property, right? So what's the whole point of a property census is to find out how much tax you owe. But if you go barreling off to some place 1,000 miles away, just to your ancestral home, it's not useful for.
And a side note, this is a side note. If people knew that this guy was related to David, I think he had a little more respect than he got.
Well, on the other hand, everybody's related to David almost, because David's son Solomon had, 1,000 potential sexual partners, 700 wives, 300 concubines, or reverse. I can't remember. But anyway, one could argue everybody's a child of David at some point.
I guess so. I guess you're right.
Anyhow, the point is, it's easy enough to see what the author of Luke is doing. He wants to connect him with David,
right,
and wants to explain how he came to be born in Bethlehem. Jesus came to be born in Bethlehem. So that's not hugely complicated. It's just complicated. It just hurts if you think about it, historically.
Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense. But that's why we need to sympathetically understand. I'm not ridiculing the author of Luke Acts here. I think he wrote a brilliant story.
Sure.
But his purpose was not to really forensically show what happened, right? It's he's telling a story that his audience will resonate with and think is cool. Property registration had to be where your property was, obviously, so there's no point going far away from that. So it can't be really likely that the author of Luke Acts just simply knows this is what happened and he's reporting the events. That doesn't make any sense, because these events did not happen that way. He's getting the story from somewhere, and even Josephus tells the story differently in War II. Also, this idea that Judas in Acts, like Theudas, is a kind of generic troublemaker. In that speech of Gamaliel, right? He says, well, don't hassle the Christians. If you think they're troublemakers, well, we've had a couple of those troublemakers. There was Theudas, there was Judas, and, look, they got their just desserts. So God will get these people if they're troublemakers. Well, that all comes from Josephus's aristocratic outlook. He doesn't need to explain Judas's motive, so he can just say he's a bad actor, he's a bad guy. But if you knew Judas independently, right, a different historian writing about Judas would presumably give him a different profile if he didn't share Josephus's prejudices, right? He wouldn't just dismiss him. Like, for example, we know that Judas, this other guy, Justus of Tiberias, I mentioned, we don't have his works, they didn't survive, but we do have quotations from them. We know some of his arguments. And he configured people completely differently. He saw Josephus as the bad guy. And some of the people Josephus disses, puts down, Justus of Tiberias elevated and thought they were good people. So if we had an independent account, you would think somebody would actually write a better version of Judas. But if an author like Luke Acts is taking Judas and using him as a generic troublemaker, where did he get that from? Who configures the registration, the apographe? By the way, same word used in Luke Acts. That's why I keep mentioning it. The apographe is the word Luke Acts uses for this census, same word Josephus used. Under Quirinius, with a popular rebellion, singling out Judas as the main villain. Who does all that? Well, Josephus does. And it suits his narrative to do it because it's a big deal in Josephus. So it therefore appears that if Luke Acts has the same configuration of events, that he's influenced by Josephus. You're going to say something, Neil?
Yeah. So look how beat up my Josephus book is. It doesn't even have a cover anymore. In the back, in the appendix, this is the what version is this? I don't know which one this is, but it's the big one. It's the one that everyone has. It seems to have a Justin book 36. What do we have, like fragments of Justin or something, or no? Is this a different Justin?
Justus of Tiberias. No, we have only the fragments that Josephus quotes from him.
Okay, so that's what that is.
So yeah.
I was just wondering what that is. Okay, so it's the fragments that Josephus. Those are the ones that we have left. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, and a writer named Photius, many centuries later, 9th century. Yeah. It will mention him.
Yeah. I love that source because he's got all the fragments in one place for you. I love.
Yeah. He's very, very cool. Yeah. Okay, I think we can go through the rest of them quickly. I don't want to keep everybody here forever and a day, but this one's pretty interesting. In that beginning of Luke, right, just after the census in Luke 2, in Luke 3, when he's talking about the main, story beginning, Jesus' baptism by John and all that, he says, in the 15th year of Tiberius, Caesar's government, that's 28-29, when Pontius Pilate was governing Judea, when Herod Antipas was tetrarching in Galilee, when his brother Philip was tetrarching in Iturea and the territory of Trachonitis, Lysanias was tetrarching in Abila. Annas was high priest with Caiaphas, right, in Jerusalem. So this guy is like overkill of dates, right? I'm telling you when this happened. I can't be any more precise. It happened 15th year of Tiberius, and all these other people doing this, that, the other thing. But the standout here is Lysanias, tetrarch of Abila. Why in earth did he mention him? It's overkill, but at least all the other names play a role in the story. This one doesn't. Lysanias never turns up again. Abila never turns up again. It seems like he's just chosen at random. Why is he there? This very conservative scholar, way back more than a century ago, Cronin, he wrote this, and I quote it because it's quite revealing. It's difficult to understand why one minor potentate of Syria, Lysanias of Abila, should be chosen for mention when others, Emeritus of Nabatea, for example, or the king of Chalcis, have at least as good or better claims to be mentioned as part of the scenery, because he just never turns up again. So what does this mean? Let's look at the map again. So he says the blue ones are the ones he mentions. Tiberius is emperor. Pontius Pilate was down there in Judea. Herod Antipas was up there in Galilee. His brother Philip was over there, right? And then in Jerusalem, Annas and Caiaphas, the high priest. Okay, fair enough. But then in the region, you've got all these other little, heads of cities and kingdoms. And he mentions this guy, Lysanias of Abilene, or Abila. Why? Just why? Why would he single him out? Because it's way far away. It's got nothing. It's up in Lebanon, right? It's got nothing to do with anything. This is the place. It's now known as the Souk Wadi Barada. On the way, it's on the main road between Damascus and Baalbek, or Heliopolis in the ancient world. We know where it is because of some inscriptions, like this inscription from the 160s CE. It said the Abilenes paid for the restoration of this area after a flood. And this inscription is very interesting. It's written by it's a scribe, copied, probably didn't know Greek very well from the looks of it.
A very weird looking Greek right there.
Yeah. Well, the words make sense, but some of the spelling is off and the grammar seems incorrect. So, but I've highlighted here so this guy, his name is Nymphios, son of Abimenos. So that's the part I underlined there. Freedman of Lysanias, the tetrarch, right? That's the part you can see there, right? In the fourth line down, Lysaniu, tetrarchu, right? And he did these things. He's a rich guy. Obviously, he's got a lot of money, and presumably it looks like Lysanias has died, but he is his freedman. And often freedmen of kings or emperors became very, very rich because they were officials, for them. So they got picked up lots of cash in the meantime. And so when he died, this guy, the freedman, he fashioned the road, he designed the road, he built a shrine, planted orchards from his own resources. That's one of the odd Greek expressions. He doesn't say idion as adion, something like that. So there's something strange going on there. But anyway, it's a fantastic inscription. It's a question of what's going on there. What's the date of it? And we have also coins from the time of Lysanias. So there's a famous Lysanias of Abila. There is one. He's especially famous and important in Josephus's account. Why? Well, because Josephus has a deep interest in the Abila region of what is now Lebanon because of its involvement in Judean politics. In the war, he calls it the house or the kingdom of Lysanias or his son, Zenodorus. And that's long after they're gone. These guys flourished in the middle of the 1st century BCE at the time of Herod.
Oh, wow.
Right? And then they're gone, but he still calls the area the house of Lysanias or the kingdom of Lysanias because he's talking about the territory. Similar in Antiquities 18 to 20, he again calls it now the tetrarchy of Lysanias after they are gone. Why? Well, because his story goes back to the 40s BC, just before Herod has become king. Lysanias' father was named Ptolemy, the son of Menaias. So he has his son Lysanias, and his son is called Zenodorus or Zenon. Ptolemy, the father, is heavily involved in Hasmonean Herodian politics. He doesn't want King Herod in power. He doesn't want the place to go Roman. He wants it to go Parthian. He's married to a Hasmonean, and his son, so he opposes the Roman support of the Herodian family, right? He wants a different political arrangement, but he doesn't succeed. And his son, Lysanias, gets into trouble with Mark Antony, who kills him in 36 BCE. He has him killed. And then his son, Zenodorus, leases the land closest to Herod's kingdom, leases it back from the Romans, and continues to stir up trouble. He agitates against Herod and Rome. He runs some bandits. He is subdued by Herod, and finally he dies. So those are the three big players: Ptolemy, Lysanias, and Zenodorus, and they are all in the late first century, middle to late first century BCE. In 20 BC, what happens to this territory? Herod gets it in 20 BCE. Then when he dies in 4 BC, it goes over to his son Philip, and later to his grandson Agrippa and great-grandson Agrippa II. So nevertheless, Josephus uses this term, Tetrarchy of Lysanias or Zenodorus, because they've been such a big part of his narrative that whenever he refers to the area again, even when he's saying that it was given to Agrippa or given to Agrippa II, he still calls it the Tetrarchy of Lysanias.
Huh.
Right? So Abila, the Tetrarchy of Lysanias, his audiences know what he means because he's using it for the sake of narrative continuity, right? Now, the question is, does this explain what Luke is doing? Luke mentions Lysanias, as I've said, without any narrative reason. It doesn't make any sense for him to mention it, right? Now, the curious thing is that scholars, being scholars, are completely distracted by the question, was there, in fact, is Luke accurate? Was there a guy named Lysanias governing Abilene in 29 CE? Well, there's no evidence, and it doesn't look likely because the area passed from Herod to Philip, and then to Agrippa I, and then to Agrippa II. So there's no real room for Lysanias there, and another Lysanias, right?
Wow.
Now that inscription that we looked at said that there's an inscription that says he's writing to the lords, the august lords, this freedman of Lysanias, right? He's writing to the august lords. So some scholars have said, well, that could only be, so, scholars being very clever, say that could only be after 14 CE, because that's when the Emperor Tiberius and his mother, Livia, had become Julia, and so you could speak of Augusti in the technical sense, or Caesars. So these are conservative scholars, especially, try to argue that inscription shows it was produced after 14, so you're getting close to the time of John the Baptist and Jesus around 30. You're getting close, at least within 15 years, and so on. So there are, what I'm trying to say is there are ways one can make a case that there was another Lysanias, not the famous one of that died in 36 BCE, a Lysanias around Jesus' time. It's possible, but it still wouldn't explain why Luke mentions him. So even if there was a guy named Lysanias who happened to be up there, it wouldn't explain why Luke mentions him, because he doesn't figure in the story. Anyway, on the inscription, that's still a bit of a stretch, because clearly this rich guy is funding projects, so he's presumably an older chap, right, whose patron has died. Lysanias no longer around. It could be already in Augustus's time, because Livia, that mother of Tiberius, is sometimes called a goddess in inscriptions, even before 14. So he could, a guy writing an inscription could easily honor them as August.
Her and Julia Dom that were the big two that got deified.
Yeah. Now she's only given the title, of Augusta in 14 CE. That's true, but she is called a goddess before that in some inscriptions in the East, right? Because you have in the East this tendency to worship like emperor worship and members of the imperial family.
He's
so
depicted holding the what do you call that? The grain, looking like Demeter, basically. Like she has that. Yeah, they have it. That's in the temple. That's in Israel too, by the way, in the temple of Augustus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, yes. So well, it depends. I mean, then you have Augustus and Rome usually worship together, right? Augustus and Roma. And so sometimes there's a question of whether Rome is being elided with Livia or not. Yeah. Anyway, let's leave that aside. But I don't want to get into any more detail on the inscription, because the main point is, even if there was, by some fluke a Lysanias that we don't know anything else about.
Yeah, no, you made a lot of sense.
Tetrarchy again. Yeah, it doesn't. So the question remains: why does Luke mention Lysanias if it's irrelevant? And I think the simplest explanation is this: that Josephus keeps mentioning this territory, and, for example, in Antiquities 18 says Gaius Caligula gave Agrippa I the Tetrarchy of Lysanias. Now, one could easily misunderstand that to mean there was a guy named Lysanias governing there. And similarly, the next volume in Josephus, in Antiquities 19, the Emperor Claudius confirmed the Abila of Lysanias for Agrippa I.
I'm seeing a pattern then. Yeah, you're
so,
seeing it. Yeah.
Yeah. So my point is, coming back to the whole point of this presentation, is that this is Josephus's configuration that fits only his narrative. It works in his narrative because he's made such a big deal of Lysanias, and now and Abila, and now he's reminding readers, that tetrarchy, that area there that belonged to Lysanias, that's now gone to Agrippa I, and he says it over and over again, right? He says it was confirmed. First, it was done by Caligula, then it was confirmed by Claudius that the Abila, or the Tetrarchy of Lysanias, would go to him. It doesn't mean there was a guy named Lysanias in that, in the 30s CE. So I think it's very easy to understand how Luke could have gotten that a little balled up. And in trying to show off, because he's clearly trying to show off, I think, in Luke 3:1-2, by listing all these, figures who were governing and high priesting and all that stuff. And he throws in Lysanias and Abilina for no reason at all in the narrative, just to show that he knows the name. In that context, it seems to me very easy to imagine that he pulled that out from Josephus and misunderstood it.
Interesting.
Right? So it's
Makes
not
that.
Sense. Yeah, I think so. Thank you. So it's an easy mistake. And again, I'm not in any way trying to ridicule Luke Acts. I think Luke Acts is a fantastic text and full of amazing stuff. But this could be an explanation, I think, a plausible one, of why because otherwise it just puzzles everybody. And the idea that there was a Lysanias there doesn't help the situation, because it doesn't explain why he did it. Okay, the next one, I think we do this one very quickly. The author of Acts, Luke Acts, uses this Theudas as another example of just a troublesome guy. When Gamaliel says, before these days, Theudas, and then there was Judas and the census. Now, in Josephus, Theudas doesn't appear in his earlier work. But in Antiquities, under the prefect Cuspius Fadus, in the middle of the 40s, when he's talking about border disputes between Jews and Idumeans and Samaritans and people of Perea, and issues about the high priest's robes, he singles out one individual as a major generic bad guy, disturber, doesn't give him any human motives at all. He doesn't like him. He just says, this guy is a bad dude. And this is what he says. When Fadus was procurator, a certain charlatan or wizard, goes of a man by the name of Theudas, persuades a large crowd to take their possessions and follow him to the Jordan River. He claimed to be a prophet, and so would part the river by command, and they would have an easy passage across the river. By these things, he tricked many people. Fadus did not allow them to indulge this foolishness, however, but sent a cavalry wing against them, which took them by surprise, did away with many, though they also took many alive. They caught Theudas alive, cut off his head, brought it to Jerusalem. This is what happened when Fadus was procurator. So again, Josephus has chosen this guy, right, and just blackened his character. He's a generic, rotten fellow. And he does that with most of the people he doesn't like. He doesn't feel any need to explain to you in a plausible way what their motives were. They just get up every morning thinking, how can I deceive people and be awful, right? He doesn't feel the need to explain, except with the very few exceptions, the men he considers pious, who also were troublemakers in a way, got into trouble like John the Baptist. He gives him some play. He explains, at least whether it's true or not, he gives him a plausible kind of backstory. He was a teacher of virtue and used to immerse people and taught them this and that. Maybe Jesus, whatever stands behind the Jesus passage, a few of the Essenes, and his own teacher Banus. He gives a fuller description. But most people, the bad guys, he just says they were bad guys, right. Awful, rotten. So Theudas has a prominent role in Antiquities 20 because Josephus chose him. Here's the Jordan River. It's a modern picture. It's slighter than it used to be, but it used to be this kind of raging torrent all the way down. And Theudas' aims are unclear, except that obviously governors are impatient with such rabble rousers. It's also not clear which direction of the river he's crossing. If he's in Judea and he's going to lead them across it, you would think they're headed out to the east. But he could have been trying to imitate Joshua's feat so they go out and then they come back and he'll part the river again so they can walk in. Anyway, Josephus is against all such types of people. He calls them wizards, charlatans, deceivers. Now, of course, because of the chronological problem that Acts puts him before Theudas, some have suggested there may have been two guys named Theudas, right? Two real guys, because again, this is on the assumption that Acts didn't use Josephus. So where did he get the name from? Well, if he puts him before Judas, he wouldn't have gotten that from Josephus because he puts him later in the 40s. And therefore, there may have been two guys. So here's, for example, Oxford Bible Scholarship or Biblical Scholarship Online. Theudas, a messianic pretender, Josephus doesn't quite say that, who promised to lead his followers in revolt against Rome. Josephus doesn't say that either. In Acts 5:36-37, Theudas is regarded as preceding Judas, who died in 6. So it would seem that either Josephus or Acts has made a mistake. However, since there were numerous other disorders, it's just possible there was another leader called Theudas who lived at an earlier date. Well, that's very fair and reasonable if the author didn't use Josephus as a source. But you see here the logic at work is because they're different, they're so different because there's a chronological discrepancy that kind of rules out Luke's dependence on Josephus. We don't need to consider that as an option. But from what I've been trying to say here, that's not really an objection. The assumption is if Luke followed Josephus, well, he would have put Judas and Theudas in their proper order. But of course, Luke couldn't follow Josephus's date, which was in the mid-40s, because the speech of Gamaliel is way back before that. It's very early, around somewhere between 29 and 32, presumably, for shortly after Jesus' death. So he's not mainly concerned with historical accuracy, nor is Josephus for that matter. He needs names. He needs a name of a generic troublemaker, right, for Gamaliel to utter. And now there's another interesting twist to this, which is that if you simply research the name Theudas, right, like many Greek names are very common, you find them all over the place, but the name Theudas actually is a very late diminutive form of Theodorus, just like the name Zenas comes from Zenodorus, and Pythas is a form of Pythodorus, and Metros, Metrodorus. These forms, these abbreviated diminutive forms, are popular only from the 2nd century onward, as it happens. So this raises the ante a little bit, right?
Wow.
What are the? Sorry, yeah.
You're going deep into this one.
Yeah. Well, I mean, then the question is, what are the odds, really, that
sure
two guys named Theudas would be cast as generic troublemakers in Judea with this unusual name, right? In the early 1st century. It's very hard to imagine, but it's very easy to imagine that Luke gets the name from Josephus. He needs the name of the bad guy, and from Josephus' point of view, these are all bad guys, and they don't get any human explanation in either case, right? And that's even more so with
nice pun.
The Egyptian. And the whole issue here turns on whether his parents really just called him the Egyptian when he was born. And this is unlikely. I mean, I think we can rule it out. His parents gave him a name. But this guy, so Acts mentions somebody called the Egyptian, and Josephus does too. But in Acts, there's no reason for it. In Josephus, there is. And this comes back again to my main principle of looking at things that have a reason in Josephus. Part of his narrative makes perfect sense, doesn't make sense in Acts. And this seems to be, in my view, I'm proposing to you evidence that it's borrowed from Josephus. So the passage in Acts is this one, and everybody knows it probably. Paul is arrested in the temple, or there's a ruckus in the temple, and the tribune steps in, the Roman tribune steps in, who's in charge of the garrison there, the auxiliary garrison. He steps in. He's dragged up into the fortress. They dragged him out of the temple. The tribune came, arrested him, ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. He inquired who he was and what he had done. Some in the crowd shouted one thing, some shouted another. As he was brought back to the barracks, presumably the Antonia fortress in Jerusalem, Paul says to the tribune, "Is it all right if I say something to you?" The other said, "You know Greek? Then you are not the Egyptian who created some agitation a while ago and led 4,000 men of the Sicarii out into the desert?" And Paul says, "No, of course not." This is a very puzzling response. Right? Paul says something in Greek, and the guy says, "What? You know Greek? So you're not the Egyptian?" This is very puzzling. This tribune, according to this story, had bought his own Roman citizenship. Presumably, he bribed somebody to join the legion. That's very common. We have lots of evidence of that. And to become and then to get promotion as an auxiliary officer as part of his chain of promotion, he'll go back to the legion after that and have a higher position. He has no idea who Paul is. He's rescuing from a crowd, but then he says he's surprised that he's not the Egyptian. Well, this is just puzzling on a million grounds. One of them is Greek was widely spoken in Jerusalem. We know that from inscriptions and from texts. So why on earth would he say to anybody he caught, "You're speaking Greek, you're not the Egyptian"? So what it looks like is, and then, I mean, to add artificiality to the speech, is who led 4,000 Sicarii into the desert? Why is that? It looks like it's for Luke's literary audience. All right, Sicarii, this is a Latin term. Your viewers probably already know. It's not a Greek word, Sicarii. It's a Latin term for, knife-wielding assassins.
Right.
There's a famous Roman law against Sicarii and poisoners because both Sicarii assassination and poisoning are insidious crimes. They're sneaky crimes where you sneak up on somebody individually and you either stab them with a concealed knife or you slip poison into their food. So they were put together as a very dangerous kind of crime that should be prosecuted.
Don't some people try to connect Iscariot to Sicarii, or has that been debunked or something?
Yeah, it's of course, scholars being clever. So Iscariot, Ish. Lots of etymologies have been proposed. Nobody knows, but so one was the idea that he was a Sicarius, and this is somehow linked to in Luke chapter 5 or 6 is Simon the Zelotes, Simon the Zealot. So Judas Iscariot, Simon the Zealot. So trying to picture Jesus' followers as this group of thugs, or half of them as thugs who kind of were saved or repented or whatever.
Right.
There's just no reason to think that, partly because according to Josephus, the Sicarii weren't around in Jesus' time, and they're not in Galilee, and they are not, it's a problem. More likely, one etymology for Iscariot is Ishkariot, a man of a place called Keriot, plural. Um,
Yeah,
but
that makes sense.
nobody really knows.
Sure.
Iscariot doesn't really work for Sicarius, and anyway, yeah, Josephus dates the Sicarii later and says quite pointedly that they only began in the late 50s. This is a new kind of crime that began in the 50s CE. Anyway, why would this tribune um, react the way he did? I mean, it's just really bizarre, right? If a policeman comes along and arrests somebody, and the guy speaks, I don't know, Italian, he says, "What? You're speaking Italian here? You mean you're not such and such a person who did this and that?" And so it seems quite clear that this speech is designed for Luke's audience, right, to show that he knows all these names, the Sicarii going into the desert, and it adds some exotic, local color to the story, but it doesn't go anywhere in the story. The simplest explanation of this is it's a mashup of Josephus bits, because Josephus is the only writer who discusses an unnamed Egyptian prophet. He's the only Greek writer who uses the Latin term Sicarii, and he does so often, and who describes would-be prophets leading people out into the desert. All of these suit Josephus's unique story, and all of them appear together in one passage next to the other in his writings. So, in War II, he says, of the bandits who were crucified by Felix, the governor, there was a countless number. So he chased down all the bandits throughout the countryside. After the countryside had been cleaned up, however, a different species of bandit was creeping up in Jerusalem, those called Sicarii. Why were they called Sicarii? Because they were doing this insidious kind of murder. They would murder people by day in the middle of the city, and they get away with it because they mingled with the mob, concealing small daggers under their clothes. And with these, they would stab their foes. And when the person fell down, they'd step back in horror and say, "Oh, look, you fell down," and be indignant with everybody else around, and they'd get away with it.
Wow.
So
I always forget about that.
then he says, in the very next paragraph, he says, a different band of contemptible fellows united with these pure in hand, that is, they didn't kill people, but more dangerous in their views, for deceitful people and rogues, in a show of divine inspiration, were persuading the mob to be possessed, and they leading them out into the desert so that God would show them signs of freedom there. So the Sicarii don't go out into the desert. The Sicarii are urban criminals, right? Their whole thing is stabbing people up close. But in the next paragraph, he mentions these would-be prophet types who lead people out into the desert to show them miracles. And then next paragraph, immediately following that, it was with a worse blow than this that the Egyptian pseudo-prophet. So he's been saying there's all kinds of pseudo-prophets around. I'm going to tell you about the Egyptian one. Now, he can call him the Egyptian because he's using it as a term of distinction against all the other pseudo-prophets. Right? There was this Egyptian fellow. He doesn't need to name him. Josephus usually names the people he's talking about. But in this case, an unusual case, he doesn't need to name him because everybody else he's talking about came from the region. But this guy, he's worthy of mention as an Egyptian, not because he's Egyptian, but because he's a pseudo-prophet who's Egyptian, right? So that's what makes him stand out. So let me tell you about this Egyptian pseudo-prophet. He really damaged the Judeans. This charlatan wizard, same term we encountered before, Goes fellow, appeared in the countryside, and having attracted to himself a prophet's trust, assembled around 30,000 of those who had been duped by him. He led them around out from the desert, right? Because they'd been led into the desert by some of the other people, to the Mount of Olives. From there, he was going to enter Jerusalem forcibly, and after overcoming the Roman garrison and the population, become a tyrant. Again, he's not a rebel against Rome in this context, but a would-be tyrant. So he's looking down from the Mount of Olives on Jerusalem and wants to take the Antonia fortress and kick out the garrison that's there. So how do you best explain this puzzling passage in Luke Acts? Well, in Josephus, as we've just seen, you have these three items in close succession,
Right.
right? You have the Egyptian, you have him leading Sicarii in Acts 21 out into the desert. Well, those three things come up in Josephus one after the other, but not the same person. The Egyptian is not a Sicarius, and the Sicarii are not going out into the desert. But in Acts, it's like a mashup of these things again. Josephus alone is the one with the reason to call him the Egyptian. If Acts had independent information about this man, presumably he'd know what his name was, right? Because he had a name. Only Josephus can call him the Egyptian and make sense of that because he distinguishes him from the other pseudo-prophets. But it's not the name his parents gave him, right? So it's to call him the Egyptian. There were lots of Egyptians in Judea. Lots of people came from Alexandria and Egypt to the festivals. So calling him the Egyptian would be like calling somebody the American in London, right, where there are hundreds of thousands of Americans. It doesn't make any sense to call somebody the American because that doesn't distinguish him. Josephus had a reason to distinguish him by this name and didn't need to know his name. That the author of Acts doesn't know his name either suggests he borrowed this from Josephus. Yeah, so that's what I spell out here. He doesn't need the name in his context. It's enough to distinguish him as the Egyptian pseudo-prophet, but it wouldn't work in other contexts because there are thousands of visitors from Egypt in Judea all the time. His parents didn't call him this. Without Josephus' context, an independent author would presumably have named him. That Luke also doesn't know his name suggests his use of Josephus. Now, the Sicarii, Josephus,
that one. You did.
He's the only Greek writer to use the name, and he does it often. Right? It was a serious crime in Rome. We have reason for Josephus to use the word because Josephus is writing in Rome. Right? So he wants a word that his Roman audience will go, ooh, yeah, fright. It's like it's a buzzword in Rome.
Yeah.
It's a shock word, right? The Roman audience is attuned to this because it's a Latin term. It makes perfect sense for Josephus to transliterate the term into Greek. He's the only Greek author who does. It's not just a generic term for killers or something. Greek has tons of words for, killing, slaughtering, butchering, all kinds of gory words for killing. Greek has its own. So Josephus uses all those as well. But he wants this, the mot juste, as you say in French, the perfect word, the right word for the occasion for his situation in Rome. And yes, for him, that's Sicarii. It doesn't work for anybody else. It wouldn't make any sense. And no other Greek authors use the term.
Wow.
But it's a Latin term. Makes sense for Josephus. So why would Luke Acts use it? And why would he mash up all these things together? Well, the simplest explanation is he's borrowing from Josephus. And we come finally to the last thing, which is, and in some ways, I think it's the most striking, partly because the first book I wrote was about Josephus's Pharisees, his treatment of the Pharisees. So for me, when I read Luke Acts and I see him describing the Pharisees in ways that I really think are characteristically Josephine, that kind of rings a lot of bells for me. So what do I mean by this? Well, there were lots of groups around in first century Judea. We don't know them all by any means. We only know a few that turn up in various sources. So we just don't know who they all were. But here are a few of them that we know about. So in the first century, like from 100 BC down to 100 CE, first century BC and CE, and some of them continued through this time. We have, yes, Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, but we also have followers of, the Qumran scrolls communities. Some people identify them with Essenes, but they don't identify themselves that way. They, just on the face of the evidence, they seem to be different
Right.
communities. Boethusians turn up in the rabbinic literature. We have various Baptist groups, John the Baptist groups, the Banus that Josephus studied with, his followers, Jesus followers. The schools of Hillel and Shammai are later identified with the Pharisees, but there may also be differences. The Hasidim, pietist groups, these Enochic groups are much studied nowadays. Various groups that we know something about, followers of Eleazar ben Shimon, Simon, Eleazar ben Hananiah at the time of the war, followers of Menachem, and then followers of Theudas earlier. The groups Josephus calls disciples or zealots. There are all kinds of groups around. And in the Gospels and Acts, when they talk about groups in Judea, they focus on the Pharisees and Sadducees as kind of two opposing groups. The Pharisees are the most persistent enemies of Jesus in Mark, in Matthew, and in John. Right? It's the Pharisees who really stick out. John mentions only Pharisees, and it kind of equates them with all Jews as what he calls children of the devil and so on. They're kind of like cosmic enemies for him. So Luke Acts is really distinctive in this way, really very, very distinctive, because the Pharisees accompany Jesus. They respect him. They keep inviting him to dinner 3 times in Luke. Only in Luke. They call him teacher. Now, Jesus is not a very good guest. When he's invited to dinner, he just sits there and criticizes the Pharisees. But they keep inviting him, and they warn him to flee from Galilee, saying Herod Antipas wants to kill him, and they accompany him to Jerusalem. All on the long trip down for Passover, they go with him because they are still there when he enters Jerusalem. And people are saying Hosanna and all that stuff in the triumphal entry. And that's where you last see them in Luke. They say, teacher, tell these people not to, praise you like this. And he says, well, let it be. But that's the last time you see Pharisees. They're not involved in his trial, unlike in Mark and in Matthew. There's continuity. It's the Pharisees who want him dead in Mark 3:6. And that eventually leads to his trial, right? But in Luke Acts, the Pharisees are hanging out with Jesus all the time. And even though they criticize some of his behavior in associating with prostitutes and tax collectors, it's not lethal. It's not that kind of problem. It's more of a dispute about, attitudes and things like that. And Jesus keeps going to dinner with them, as I said. So Luke Acts distinguishes very sharply between these popular, loved Pharisees who are loved by the people, and Jesus is in the same social group, and the harsh temple-based Sadducees, right, who are a totally different breed. These are the guys with the power, and they're the ones who killed Jesus. The priests and Sadducees kill him, and they want to silence his followers, right? If you read Acts 4, Acts 5, Acts 3, Acts 4, Acts 5, you see chief priests who are Sadducees wanting to kill the apostles. They are opposed by the Pharisee Gamaliel.
And then
right,
Paul is also a Pharisee too.
Yes, exactly. And not only that, but tons of Pharisees join the Christian movement, right? According to Acts 15.
There it is, Paul,
a lot of Pharisees become Christ followers in Acts.
Makes sense.
Right? So this is a very, very different picture from the one you would get from John, for sure, and from Mark, right? And here's the passage you're talking about, brothers. I'm a Pharisee, son of the Pharisees, and great clamor arose with the Pharisees saying, we don't find anything wrong with this guy, but the Sadducees do. And then later, Paul says to Agrippa, all the Judeans have known me from the start that I lived as a Pharisee according to the most precise school. So he's a Pharisee, and that the Pharisees are, as he says here, Agrippas and Hyresen. It's the most accurate or precise school. Now, coming back then to this, Josephus chooses out of all these groups, he makes a kind of triad of important groups: Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes. He says at this time there were three Haireses among the Judeans, which regarded human affairs differently. These were the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. And he arranges them as a triad. On one side, believe in fate completely. On the other side, Sadducees, no fate. Middle view, Pharisees, some things due to fate, others no. So a very neat package. This is the three philosophical schools that Josephus keeps referring to repeatedly: Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes. Question is, did anyone else in pre-70 Judea know about three schools? I think not. This is Josephus. The reason I say that is we have lots of sources, actually, that talk about Pharisees and Sadducees, Mark, Q, Paul, Matthew, John, the early rabbis. They all either talk about Pharisees alone or contrast Pharisees with Sadducees. None of them mentions Essenes. Whereas the sources that mention Essenes, who are Philo, Pliny, the elder, and most often in Josephus himself, they treat the Essenes as a unique group. Certainly Philo and Pliny do.
Philo talks about them like they're doesn't he compare them with the Therapeutai?
Yes, except he compares and contrasts them. So the Therapeutai are contemplatives, right? They follow the contemplative philosophical life, whereas the Essenes follow the active philosophical life. He says that at the beginning of his essay on the contemplative life. He says, I just wrote an essay on the Essenes, which we don't have anymore. But he also wrote two other essays on the Essenes, which we do have. Well, one of them talks about the Essenes as an example of virtue, of being inwardly independent and all that. And one is in a work called The Apology, Defense of the Judeans, and he features the Essenes. So he's really high on the Essenes. But he mentions them as sui generis, as like they're unlike anybody else. And he doesn't put them together with Pharisees and Sadducees. And nor does Josephus.
There's nowhere in Philo that you can get anything that you're seeing in Luke.
No.
Okay.
No. But Josephus has it all, right? So the language and the characterization. So, for example, first of all, this distinctive view of Pharisee-Sadducee relations with Jesus, right, as separating Pharisees as popular and having the support of the people and being around Jesus, and Sadducees being something different and harsh and brutal in the temple, right? And the language of Haireses and Agrippas, the most precise. All this is Josephine, right? So here's a summary of what I was just saying. Many independent sources mention some of these groups: Paul, Philo, Pliny, Mark, Matthew, John, Q, early rabbis. Only Josephus selects three and calls them schools of philosophy, Haireses. Haireses usually, in its basic meaning, it's very general. It just means a choice or a taking or even a seizure of something. That's what hairesis literally means, from haireo, take. But in Josephus, half of his 31 examples refer to one of these schools, a philosophical school. And in the New Testament, elsewhere, when the word hairesis appears, it's in a bad sense. It's a faction to be avoided. It's something bad. And it's the origin of the later word heresy. Heresy comes from hairesis, Greek hairesis. So elsewhere in the New Testament, bad thing. So it's only in Luke Acts that both the Christians and the Pharisees are called a hairesis, right? Which is a good thing. They are a school, the most accurate school, Acts says, for Paul. So back in War II, you have Josephus saying, remember about Judas the Galilean, he was a sophist of his own school, for there are three forms of philosophy that are legitimate among the Judeans. The first Hieresis were Pharisees and other Sadducees and other Essenes. And then, at the end of that passage, of the former two, the Pharisees, are reputed to interpret the legal matters with precision, akribeia, and they constitute the first irises. This is Josephus' language. Then later in his autobiography, he talks about the irises of the Pharisees, who are reputed to excel the others in akribia. That is, they are the most akribes. They are the akribestate in the superlative form of the adjective. They are the most precise school. So what is unique to Josephus as an author is that you have three Judean groups, that they are labeled hiereses, that is philosophical schools in his usage, and that the Pharisees are reputed to be the most precise.
Wow, that's a very specific word.
Yeah.
Use, and they're both using that.
And the contrast between lenient and popular Pharisees who are forgiving and, like Gamaliel in Acts, want to give the Christians, a second chance, give them freedom, and the harsh aristocratic savage, Josephus calls them, Sadducees, who like to punish people harshly, right? So all those four things are Josephine distinctives, and all four of them characterize Luke Acts. They are not mere observations that anybody could see, right, of reality. They are distinctive literary choices. For example, akribe is one of Josephus's favorite words. He uses it in a wide range of contexts, also for the writing of history. You can either do it, with akribe or not. You can do it sloppily. With akribe means precisely, carefully, right? Accurately. So I'm at the end, at my conclusions. The author of Acts did not know Judean politics at first hand. That's not a criticism of him. Clearly, he's not from Judea. He used written and oral sources, of course. So which ones? We know that he used Mark, and by hypothesis, either Q or Matthew. If he didn't use Q, he used Matthew. Common view is he used Q. And any author, we know, presents events uniquely, because events and narratives about events are different things. Events don't explain themselves. You need to use some kind of language to describe them. So whoever Luke's source was shared Josephus's outlook and language. That's the simple, that's demonstrable. So the simplest hypothesis, of course, therefore, is that Josephus himself was among Luke's sources. Wow. And why not? Because it fits this larger picture that we already have, that Josephus was, as you said right at the beginning, recognized as the authority on Judean life. He likes to zero in on individuals, so he gives a collective description and says, there were all these pseudo-prophets. Let me tell you about this one. There are all these troublemakers. Let me tell you about this one. That's his characteristic way of, enlivening his narrative by not just referring to groups, but giving you a specific example. He does that everywhere in his narrative. It's just absolutely typical of him and of many writers, but even more reliably typical of him. He includes names of selected people with little explanation because he can. He doesn't expect his Roman audiences to follow all this stuff. I mean, they've never been to Judea. Josephus is showing off his expertise, right, as a Judean. That's the whole point of his writing. He's saying, I was there. I'm a Judean. You guys are writing about the war and you were never there. You don't know what happened. I was there. I know the place intimately. So Josephus is showing off his expertise by mentioning all these names. He doesn't need to explain everything because his audience trusts him. So he uses characteristic language, the apographe of the senses, Pharisees, Hieresis, the Sicarii, the Egyptian, for his audience in Rome. Luke is attempting something vaguely similar for his story about Christian origins, but he lacks the personal, direct expertise, the knowledge. He has to borrow it from somebody, and he borrows from some kind of expert. Neither one was very concerned with, perfect chronological accuracy, keeping everything straight. They were both quite willing to jumble stuff up. Josephus changes things around a lot between his War, his earliest work, and his Antiquities. He rewrites stories in completely different ways, changes the order. And I'm simply suggesting not that Luke Acts was an inferior writer, just he does the same thing Josephus does. But he had to borrow somebody's expertise, and that's the difference. Now, this hypothesis would date Luke Acts later than about 95, maybe even 100 to be plausible. But I have no stake in that question. For me, it's so again. I'm not championing this because I believe it. It's just that research on the question and research into Josephus, especially in his ways of writing, and recognizing these as distinctive Josephian traits that are not given. They're not just in the facts, they're the way that he chooses to write. If his trademarks turn up in Luke Acts, and they are not trademarks of Luke Acts, they seem like random occurrences in Luke Acts. Lysanias of Abilene and Sicari and the Egyptian in the desert. These don't go anywhere in Luke Acts. They're just random kind of things that he drops in there. Well, if they fit Josephus's narrative and they don't fit Luke Acts like that, he has no reason to have them there. The simplest hypothesis, I think, doesn't mean it's true. It just means it's the simplest hypothesis is that he got them from Luke Acts, I think.
Absolutely. I think you I think you demonstrated like without any doubt on what's the most likely scenario. Like especially when you look at certain words being used to describe an event, it's like that doesn't the odds of that happening twice just doesn't happen. Like it looks like it's dependent on it looks like they're using that source. So I don't even know how you can argue against what you're saying. I mean, has anyone maybe that's a question I can ask you, because I'm totally convinced on what you just said. But has anyone came with any counter arguments that you think are worth noting?
Well, I've seen plenty of people disagree, but I think it's the sad state of scholarship. If I can be perfectly honest with you about my own impressions here, I'm being very candid and not very I don't want to say politically correct, but I'm not being very maybe professionally correct, sticking up for the discipline. The problem is we're in a time when we live in silos.
Yeah.
There's so much publication. There's so much coming out. So many presses have come up, so many journals now, and they've just flourished, and they continue to expand, and people start new journals and publish collections of essays on this, that, and the other thing from conferences that only people who are of a certain mind will attend. And so we live in increasingly atomized, fragmented kind of scholarly landscape. And so in answer to your question, there are people I've seen, perfectly respectable scholars. I even shared a volume with one of them. I wrote an article on the Pharisees. So there's a volume on the Pharisees. He wrote on Luke Acts and the Pharisees. I wrote on Josephus and the Pharisees. In my conclusion, I made a link to Luke Acts, just a suggestive one. He wrote on Luke Acts. I didn't want to step on his toes. But in the course of his essay, he just kind of categorically said, so, this idea of Luke Acts borrowing from Josephus really doesn't stand up. That was about it. He
always said.
But he didn't feel any need to explain that. He did give a reason, but I honestly can't remember what it was. But it was irrelevant to the case I've put forward. It was just something, completely different, some other consideration. But I think it's based on this assumption still that if somebody borrowed from Josephus, it would be, they would spell it out somehow, or it would be in the correct order, or it would be sustained quotation or something,
Right.
which is
I,
always
I'm
implausible.
I'm getting this from Josephus. Like you would think like that's what they're expecting, that type of evidence to be there when
Yeah,
you're saying no one does that anyway.
right. No one does that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it
So
would be considered really uncool to do that. I
yeah,
mean,
especially
yeah,
for a gospel story. You're not gonna.
yeah, yeah. They just don't do that. Yeah,
Well,
yeah,
I was. It made a lot of sense. It really does. It makes a lot of sense because this is like this especially Luke. Out of all four of the gospels, Luke seems to have the most data on like geography and events happening, especially when you combine it with Acts. There's a lot of stuff being thrown around that would require knowledge.
yep.
Someone who's very educated, or well, maybe both, educated
Mhm,
and having sources around them so they can
mhm,
write this story in a certain way.
mhm,
Then the next question is what sources are there out there?
mhm.
Boom, Josephus is right in front of your face at that point. As soon as you're asking that question, Josephus. All right, what else do we have? Pliny, we got Philo. Those are the stuff that we have. So it doesn't take that long to figure out. Okay, what is he talking about? Oh, he's talking about the Judas guy,
Yeah,
Theudas, the Egyptian. What else? He's talking about these different groups, Essenes and Sadducees, and different locations that they're going to. And where we find that? We find that in Josephus. So yeah, I mean,
yeah. And again, the old counter argument was basically just to say, well, there was some other source that had all this information.
right,
But then, if you seriously come to grips with the nature of ancient writing and realize that these are not given by the events, right? That's the point. These are not something that the events themselves forced on a writer. Any writer could use different language, include different things. That's the point, is that Josephus's choices, Sicari, Acribea, Acribestate, Hierasis, Egyptian, all of these things that make sense in Josephus turn up, apographe, yeah, all this stuff is in Luke Acts too. So that reflects somebody's choice of writing, and the one we know chose not just mentioned these events, but chose this way of characterizing them was Josephus. And one can say, well, there maybe some other source also did that. Yeah, but what are the chances?
right.
Yeah,
Anything's possible. We're talking
yeah,
about you and I know you're very careful about likelihoods. Never saying it's guaranteed this or it's guaranteed that.
yeah,
It's what's the likelihood? This is probably the likelihood. So, you know,
yeah.
anyone in the comments can let us know what you think. If you have anything you want to throw it out there and type it in the comments, and we can respond. You've been giving me your time so graciously, and I want to. If you have anything you want to promote or any links that you want to talk about, I can put it in the description for you. And then yeah, we'll finish this thing up.
I have a new book coming out this month called. I don't expect anyone to buy it. It's from a European publisher, academic publisher that's fairly expensive for most people's pockets, including mine. But the book is called. You might be able to get it some other way through a library or something. It's called Jews and Christians in the Roman World,
Wow.
from historical method to cases. So again, it's an academic title. It's a little academic in some of the chapters, but it's using case studies, including this one. So the academic form of this presentation is in that book as one of the chapters. But all kinds of chapters on John the Baptist, on Paul, on Josephus and the Flavian regime,
Wow.
on Josephus' way of writing.
I'll
Five or six.
I'll be getting it. That's for sure.
Okay.
And
Five or six
it might be
chapters.
it might be available in libraries, right?
Yeah, especially digital libraries. If anyone has access to a university library, or there may be other ways to to get it in less expensively. I think the book will be, probably pushing 180, $200, something like that. So it's an expensive hardcover, well bound and sewn binding and all that. But Brill, the publisher, makes them for library use.
Right.
So they're quite expensive books, but because it's meant to be an enduring book in a library. That's why they do it that way. They say.
Right.
But then they do also have contracts for digital versions with various people. So you may find a digital version somewhere that is free or whatever. Yeah.
Well,
anyway, so that's coming out this month, actually. Yeah.
I'll put that link in the description when it comes out. That way, anyone who's watching this a month from now will be able to find it, and maybe they can go to their local library and ask them if they have it, so they can rent it or whatever. But yeah, thank you for your time. I've really loved this. I'm always glad to have you on, and you have just attained true gnosis.
You have just attained true gnosis. The demiurge has no power over